Welcome back. I'm going to be upfront and admit that if you're looking for an answer to the question asked by the title of this video, well, I don't have one. First off, I have to explain a little bit about my stance on this issue. I don't have children of my own, but I plan to one day, so I spend a lot of time thinking about and discussing this topic, but this isn't meant as a judgment on anyone else. I realize that talking about dealing with children is very different from actually dealing with them. Also, I'm aware that children, just like all people, are vastly different, and so there's almost certainly no one approach to discipline that will always work. But that doesn't mean we can't say anything about the effectiveness of different parenting techniques or disciplinary approaches. After all, we don't know that smoking causes cancer because we literally see the cancer cells forming after someone smokes. No, we know cigarettes cause cancer because of the massive amount of data we have on the topic. And I think so too we can make claims about discipline. We just have to be cautious and admit when we don't have enough data to make conclusive statements. But we need not ignore inconclusive data because even if it gives us no real certainty, it can still be suggestive. So like always, when I want to know more about something, I think it's a good idea to see what science has to say on the matter. So I found this article from Scientific America. The article is from about a year ago, and it talks about a meta-analysis that used 75 published studies that examined the relationship between spanking a child and various developmental outcomes, both mental and physical. The analysis concluded that spanking was associated with 13 of 17 negative outcomes being assessed. Meanwhile, spanking was associated with no positive outcomes. Studies continue to find that spanking predicts negative behavior changes. There are no studies showing that kids improve. Which isn't to say that no good can come from spanking, but it would seem that if there are benefits, they're either very small, or spanking isn't being utilized effectively by most parents in practice. But for that to be the case, there would have to be more and less effective ways of spanking, which I think is probably true. After all, if spanking is too gentle, then it's not really a punishment. However, if it's too hard, at some point it stops being punishment and just becomes abuse. So I think if we want to keep talking about spanking as an appropriate form of discipline, then we have to talk about what is and isn't effective. Like, how hard should I spank? How often? What behavior justifies spanking and what doesn't? I think these are all important questions we have to ask. When I was a child, I was spanked, and my mom thought she was doing a good job of disciplining me. In actuality, she wasn't, when it comes to spanking at least. The reason is that after a few smacks on the bottom, I sort of became less sensitive to the pain, and on top of that, I realized if I pretend just right and play it off convincingly enough, then I can pretend like it hurts more than it does. So then over the next couple of years, as I got older and my ass got used to the spanking, I was able to just basically get away with anything. All I had to do was take my spankings and pretend like it hurt a little, and pretend like I was sorry. And then instead of not doing it again, I just learned to get better at getting away with it. And when I did get caught, it didn't matter because the punishment was basically just a game to me. But here's the thing, if my mom had found out that I was just pretending like it hurt, what could she have really done about it? She could have smacked me harder, but if I'm already pretending like it hurts, how would she know for sure when it actually does hurt? Would she have to make sure by leaving a mark? If so, at what point does that become abuse? I mean, especially when I got older. If spanking was my punishment as a child and the only way I learned how to behave was from being spanked, then what happens when I become a teenager and my parents' spankings don't really do anything anymore? Well, one possibility is that I will just have no respect for rules or authority. After all, if the only thing keeping me in line was fear of punishment, then why would I still behave when the fear of punishment is gone? Unless I've also learned why I ought to obey the rules. Similarly, the article addresses this issue. If spanking is not working, and spanking is all the parents are doing, then they're going to escalate. So now this leaves us with an interesting question. If spanking can be a flawed way of disciplining children that may even allow some parents to be fooled by their own children into thinking they're disciplining them when in actuality they are not, then why do it? I mean, if it could potentially cause your child to have more problems as an adult, is it worth the risk even if it does help discipline them? I think there are a number of reasons someone might answer yes to this question, but there are a couple that are worth looking at. And again, I'm not saying spanking can't be an effective way of disciplining children, I'm just saying that it can be flawed. I think the main reason I've heard in favor of spanking is that it's the final straw. But this should hardly be reassuring to any parent wanting to give their child the best chance of a great future, because if spanking is the final straw, then it must be the ultimate disciplinary tool when all else fails. But as I've already mentioned, spanking can be a failed tactic as well. So what do you do when your surefire plan fails? The other reason I've heard a lot is, they are my children and I will discipline them however I please. Well, that's fine, but it's also irrelevant to the discussion because I'm not concerned with the wants of random parents. I'm concerned with how effective spanking is as a practical technique for disciplining a child. Another reason someone might give is that it's used as a punishment, while another approach is being used alongside it as a way of teaching the child why what they did was wrong. And while this is a much more satisfactory answer, the fact still remains that it is yet to be seen that there aren't more effective ways than spanking children to accomplish this goal. But if I want to say that this is a true claim, then the burden of proof would fall on me to prove that there are better ways of doing this. But I'm not making that claim because I honestly don't know. However, I think the moment we think we have the answers is the moment we stop looking for better ones. And that for me is the key here. I don't want to raise my kids the way my parents raised me. I want to do better. So moving on, the article also cites some limitations on the meta-analysis, such as that it doesn't really address the problem of which comes first, the bad behavior or the spanking. In other words, are children who get spanked actually becoming worse adults because they get spanked, or are they just bad people and so spanking is just a consequence of that, and they were going to act like bad people as adults regardless? But this doesn't really change anything. After all, that doesn't magically make spanking an effective technique, it just makes it not a dangerous or particularly risky one. But what else can we do? I mean, I rarely hear people advocating for other forms of discipline. It's almost always either spank your child or they will be a spoiled rotten brat, or don't spank them or they'll become a mentally disturbed spouse and child beating low-life scum. But obviously neither of these are true for the majority of people. I could ask a million people about their childhood, and many of them will have been spanked and turned out just fine, and many of them will not have been spanked and turned out just fine, and many of them will not have turned out okay, regardless of whether or not they were spanked as a child. So we must be careful not to let anecdotes cloud our judgment. But again, what else can we do? After all, the data is inconclusive. One option would be to try different approaches and just see what works, but this has its own risks. If I try different approaches to discipline my child and they don't work, then at best I've wasted my time, and at worst I may have done something that actually reinforces the bad behavior. And this is what worries me the most. Are effective approaches to disciplining children actually linked to positive outcomes as adults? If not, then we have to ask ourselves what our goal as parents are, to discipline our children now, or create better outcomes in the future. But I think this is likely a moot point, because I do think there are probably approaches that can both discipline a child and produce better outcomes as an adult. That isn't to say that the approach will work for all children, or even that it'll always work for an individual. I'm well aware that parenting is only a small part of what shapes us into the adults we become, and so it will not be the only factor or even necessarily the biggest factor. But still, it is a factor, and it does have some weight on how we turn out. And unlike all the other things we can't control in our child's lives, we can control how we treat them. So what approaches can we use? Well, I'm not a parenting expert or a psychologist, but I think the best bet would be to try approaches that have been shown to change behavior. And the best technique I know of is critical thinking. Now, with children, obviously, we have to keep in mind that they will be limited in how complex of an idea they can understand, but all that means is that we need to choose our words carefully and probably be extra patient. But ultimately, the goal would be to get the child to understand what they did and understand why it was a bad thing to do. But again, I know that ideas in theory are not always going to go as planned, so I'm well aware that when I have children, I can't just talk to them every single time they do something bad and expect them to always remember and always understand what's being told to them. But at the same time, I don't want to decide not to spank them and then not have a plan for discipline and just let them get away with everything. And so this in many ways is why I'm making this video. I want to know what people have found that works and doesn't work. I'm not having kids yet, so I have plenty of time to figure it all out. But if you're a parent, or even if you've just spent a lot of time watching after little kids, what have you found to be the best and worst approaches to discipline? Are there ways to teach children about morality and ethics that you found to be particularly effective? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.